Hello and welcome to Hour of History. This is your host, Stephen Bauman, and we have Travis Roy back in the studio this week. Frequent contributor, good friend, and great historian. It's another episode brought to you by Printful. Printful is easy, on-demand, online printing, fulfillment, and shipping. Just go to hourofhistory.com/Printful. hourofhistory.com/Printful. There, you will see all the various custom products you can choose from for you or your business. There's mugs, sweatshirts, hats, swimwear, all that, and much, much more. Go to hourofhistory.com/Printful now and mock up merch with your own custom brand to sell from your store, i.e. this awesome Hour of History podcast flag that adorns the studio and is in the background of all of the great images we have with our even greater guests. Thanks again for listening to Hour of History. Remember to subscribe and subscribe, easy for me to say, and share it with those of your friends, the people that you care about, the people that you love, and the people that you want to know more history. One of the most important things in our world. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy.
This is the Hour of History podcast. Our world, anytime, any place. And now from the Hour of History studio in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Hour of History. This is your host, Stephen Bauman, and frequent guest contributor, Travis Roy.
I'm getting very comfortable in the studio of the Hour of History.
I know, it's a comfortable studio. It's one I've grown accustomed to. We've had a lot of good conversations in these doors.
For sure.
Look at me getting all emotional at the end of the semester.
How many episodes have you done now?
So this is episode number 53. 53, yeah.
You're in it now. Yeah.
I know, and I'd like to point out that it's come out, regularly every single Saturday. So quite an achievement. Thank you for listening, subscribing, joining. The guests have been frequent and been good. It's funny, the hour long is really productive, I find. There's some history podcasts out there that are only doing, short snippets of 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, but I think an hour you can kind of get to the heart of it. I think I would love to just talk forever. But.
Sure. I mean, that's partly why I'm back, right? Is because the last hour that we took, we started talking, and then it was like, oh, well, that went very quickly. Yeah. So thank you for having me back.
Yeah, good. And last time we had, both times actually you've been on, we've talked about popular culture, and we've had conversations about, cultural history coming in and out. But each time it's like, I just think of all these things that we didn't talk about. And we're recording this now, 3 weeks after Stan Lee passed away. Stan Lee, the creator of Marvel.
Does he need any introduction?
I am super uninformed on comics.
Okay. I mean, I like to think that I am pretty informed in comics, but it is with horror that I realized after I was on here last time that I gave you a little bit of misinformation about Stan Lee. I gave him credit for co-creating Captain America, which he did not do. That was Joe Simon. So, so even I struggle. There's a lot, and Stan Lee's had he'd lived for 95 years. He's had a very
extraordinary.
He had a very productive life, but it gives me hope as a young man teetering on 40 that he didn't really get going. I mean, he was the editor of Marvel, but he didn't really Marvel wasn't successful until he was 38, 39 years old, maybe even in his early 40s.
He had a really fascinating life, huh?
Yeah.
I did my homework. I read the obituary, and I was just reading about just envisioning this guy in an office on Madison Avenue in Manhattan. And we don't have those parallels anymore. If you're a guy in an office in Madison Avenue, you're doing all right already.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we have those people around, and I think there is a lot of hope in people who see Stan Lee and kind of think people who are doodling. There's millions of people doodling and have ideas. Why was he so successful?
Well, what Stan Lee did that set him apart from his peers, there was a couple things he did. He developed what they called the Marvel method, which enabled, it was like a collaborative process between writer and artist, where basically like the writer would have kind of a broad outline of what they were going to do, and they would present that to the artist, and the artist would kind of take liberties and draw what they wanted to draw, with leaving large dialogue bubbles for Stan to come in and complete. So that's something that kind of was part of it, and that's partly where some of the propriety issues have come from in terms of who created what. But more so than that, what Stan Lee did was he took the superhero trope and made them human. Like the Fantastic Four was his breakthrough, and these were not these people took their powers. They perceived them as a curse, and half of them were family, and they were bickering amongst each other. There was arguments, that kind of stuff. His characters were always very fallible and very believable. And so when you say that he's inspired a lot of people to draw and that kind of stuff and to write, absolutely. But more so than that, I think that he can be credited with instilling in people a lot of what our ideas of what a hero is kind of comes from him. Someone who's flawed but is able to do the right thing. The whole with great power comes great responsibility thing. So I think his contribution is pretty unique in that he inspired generations of people.
Yeah. I think I'm thinking about these superheroes, and there is a mix of like this fiction and characters that have tropes that have been done over and over, and you have like Jekyll and Hyde, and this the Hulk is this kind of Jekyll and Hyde sort of thing, but beyond that, we also live in an age now of individuality where like the self is pretty central, and the understanding of sort of like the divine is more in tune with superheroes. Like we're getting to a stage, I think, of where like Greek gods are coming in, and this is kind of like how I see superheroes. As Greek gods used to come down from Mount Athos and mess with the Athenians, and then they'd go back to their Greek lives. And this is kind of like what you just described with the superheroes. I don't know if there's anything there, but
well, I mean, he did help develop Thor as a superhero too, which is of course it's a Norwegian or Scandinavian god. But so that I think that's a good parallel right there. But yeah, I find myself often interested in like recreation of characters, the reconfiguration of characters, and how they can represent culture, and how they can serve in different mediums and different roles over time. And these superheroes, I mean, not just Stan Lee's creations and not just Marvel's ownership, but superheroes in general are really well disposed to do that kind of thing, because I mean you have constantly new writers and artists coming in and reimagining them. They track for decades sometimes if they're popular enough. So it's just really an opportunity to you can really learn a lot about our culture by looking at them.
Yeah, and it's kind of like history where if you want to know the present, study how the historians are viewing the past.
Sure.
But I'm thinking of the superheroes like ownership sort of. Are superheroes unchangeable now? Like, is Stan Lee's creation of whatever this shows my lack of knowledge. Wolverine, is he Stan Lee?
No, he was not Stan Lee.
Dang it!
I don't think so. Stan Lee didn't create
Spider-Man.
He co-created Spider-Man.
Okay.
And he did co-create the X-Men, but not Wolverine specifically. I'm pretty sure that was
the Beast.
He may have been behind Hank McCoy. I'm not sure exactly, but
yeah, I'm trying to act like I know. But so are these guys are essentially owned by Stan Lee forever, right?
No. They were owned by Marvel forever, and then bought by Disney. And actually, at one point, when Disney bought Marvel in 2009, Stan Lee tried to sue Disney, even though he was given, I want to say around $10 million for it, which is no small chunk of change. But when you consider the MCU has made over $17 billion in the past less than 20 years, that's a minor fraction. So in 2012, he actually tried, I believe 2012, he tried to sue Disney for rights to his characters back, because he had actually left Marvel, started Stan Lee Media Group or Stan Lee Media something or other. and tried to like work with those characters there, but he wasn't able to do it. It's ironic. The last 20 years or more of his life, he really didn't have a lot to do with Marvel beyond showing up in the cameos for the films, which is even more ironic because the man moved to L.A. Like 1980 or something, and under like the trying to redirect Hollywood to appreciate superheroes and make superhero movies, and he just chipped away and chipped away and chipped away at it, like nobody listened to him. And then these movies got made that he had very little to do with, and became these runaway blockbusters. Yeah,
let's talk. We can get back. I hope we can get back to Stan Lee's life, but I want to talk about like this sort of way society, American society, views comics. Mm-hmm. Like my experience I worked in a library in a middle school in Brooklyn.
Okay.
And one of the only things students would read are comics, and they would go, I think it was Wishbone was one, or like I don't even know, and Mouse was the other one,
I know Mouse.
The famous World War II one, and the students would devour those. Like they loved to read them. They would check them out all the time and finish them like within the day, and you'd be like, wow, you read that at lunch. And then, but there's like this, that's not real reading.
Well, I mean, so there's always been, for a long time, there's been this tendency to look at comic books as well. I mean, they started off as like pulp fiction, right? Pulp novels, pulp, so dismissed from their inception in a lot of ways. And Stan Lee himself, as editor of Timely Comics, then Atlas Comics, then finally Marvel Comics, he used to like go to cocktail parties and tell people he was a writer. He lied. In fact, his real name was Stanley Lieber, but he changed his name to Stan Lee because he was saving Stanley Lieber for the great American novel that he thought he'd write someday, and he was ashamed.
Wow.
It wasn't until his 40s and they really became successful he started being honest about what they were. But Stan Lee, and again, I'm focusing more on Stan Lee. That's kind of where my interest is Marvel. But to address your question about reading comics, like Stan Lee, when he wrote comics that he wanted to read. As a man in his 40s, 50s, whatever, like he did not try and dumb stuff down for a younger audience. He wasn't trying to write to college kids, even though that became really popular with college kids in the 60s and 70s. He just wrote what he thought that were interesting stories, and he made sure he used words that were relatively, you didn't have to break out a dictionary to learn. So I think that it is the accessibility of comic books that make them so resonant, combined with, of course, the serial nature of them. Like people people love stories that carry on forever, and you have to like pick up and that kind of stuff. You get to know the characters. You could struggle with Iron Man's drinking problem all along with him if you wanted to. That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a lot of depth and pathos to comic books in general that if you don't read them, you're going to probably be pretty dismissive of them. Bill Maher got himself in very hot water recently.
Yeah, why don't you explain that?
Because after Stan Lee died, can I swear on your show?
You can. We are explicit.
Okay. Like a true asshole, Bill Maher blows in and releases this blog post where he says essentially only in only in America where you would idealize comic books and would Trump become president, that kind of thing, and saying he inspired people to do, saying that he said, what does Stan Lee inspire people to do? Read, watch movies, like what is it? And if Stan Lee had died 20 years ago, that comment probably would have just slipped through the cracks and no one would have cared.
Yeah.
But the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, has reintroduced people and people are emotionally attached to these characters in a way that they may not have been on such a broad level before. So I think that that stigma is fading.
It's fading fast.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to watch, and the backlash on Bill Maher was like more attention than he's ever got. So maybe he considers it successful, but people were furious, and Bill Maher is the guy who tries to poke the bear all the time. Like he's always trying. That's his gig, is trying to get people angry. And I remember, sort of watching him way back when he did Religulous, even thinking like you're not you're not critiquing religion here. You just sound like an asshole. And so it's interesting to see people can now push back with social media directly.
Yeah, that's fun.
So the feedback's immediate, and it is interesting that you see these people that might have been ashamed of their comic book reading now. They can find allies, friends.
Yeah. And I think it's also worth mentioning that that Stan Lee helped empower a lot of minority groups, and like in a time where people of color were not represented in science fiction or superhero mediums or whatever. He made it, and he claims that he would never had a political agenda exactly, and that he was just trying to represent reality. But whatever the case, a lot of people felt themselves represented in an area where they otherwise weren't represented through Marvel comic books too. So he's resonated through in a lot of different ways.
And he was outspoken about that too, right? Like he didn't hide behind his comic sort of thing.
Quite the opposite. He was very happy to put himself. He loved the limelight. He was very happy to put himself front and center.
But we have the idea, or at least the Bill Mahers of the world, and even like the 1950s, 1960s American whatever.
Yeah. I mean, and that to interrupt you real quick.
Sure.
That actually like gets like at another point that I kind of glazed over, which in that era, the 50s and mostly the 50s. Marvel and comic books in general were really struggling because as rock and roll became more prevalent, people were asking themselves, what's wrong with our kids? What are they doing? They're listening to this rock and roll and they're reading these comic books. And comic books, kind of like the Satanic Panic in the 1980s, or like the parental advisory in the 90s movement kind of thing. Like comic books became under fire in the 1950s for being disruptive, and
it was a subversive thing to do.
Yeah, so probably there are still some people like that the generation that maybe would have grown up thinking like either they read comics or they thought that they were fluff, or they thought that they were like actually degenerative to like juveniles, that kind of thing. So those people, that kind of mentality is, I think, fading.
Yeah, but would you say that like the comics of Stan Lee's time, and say, so what, he's in the 50s when he gets really big, or the 60s?
The Marvel really hit its stride with Fantastic Four in 1961.
1960. Okay, so at that time, is there there's competition, and like there's a lot of new comics coming out, and up. It feels like, are we getting to a mono comic culture, or is the comic world getting big and same? Like there's a lot of new voices coming out.
That's a good question. I mean, there's always been upstarts, independent comics. Anyone listening to this that's familiar with independent comics will probably be very frustrated by me and my fixation on Marvel. But independent comics don't often resonate the same way. I mean, like it's partly a matter of distribution. They're not making movies out of, say, I can't
small, low budget.
Nothing springs immediately to mind, but that cultural importance kind of is latched on to, well, Disney owns them now, Marvel now.
Yeah.
So that's a big
well, that's
part
kind
of
of like what I'm hitting at, and we touched on it at the very end of the last episode.
Well, let's pick up on that point.
Yeah, there's this great fear I have that in maybe it'll be 5 or 10 years, everyone will have their podcast and everyone will have their own Netflix shows. I think 4 years ago, had I polled my classes, we would all be watching Black Mirror. We would all be watching, 4 different other shows.
Yeah.
Now, when I do my informal polls, the only show is Stranger Things. No other show, not even Narcos or anything that's widely popular on Netflix, is being watched by everyone. Because there's so much being produced, but being produced by the same giant mammoth corporation.
Well, and I think you also have to account for the age group that you were going to be generally polling, which is not a bash against people of that age, but I mean, they're not necessarily going to be watching Narcos.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, I'm not saying there aren't people that are in their early 20s that are going to be watching Narcos. I'm just saying, other things may appeal to them.
So, but that's what I'm saying is that there's a high level of choice. So, like,
absolutely.
are we headed to a place? And it seems like choice is getting more and more tailored to what we want. Like, are we headed to a place where not everyone understands who Spider-Man is?
I think we're already there.
Okay, so
honestly, I think we're already there. I mean, obviously, like the vast majority of people are going to be like, oh, Stan Lee, Captain America, whoever, whatever. We know who those people are. But when I talk to people who are 20 years younger than me,
right.
I am seldom surprised to learn that they know very little about Stan Lee or about the Beatles or about other things that I could take for granted as being iconic.
But the character they recognize.
They might. I mean, more than. I mean, I would say now almost definitely. I mean, when in terms of like the movies coming out and that kind of stuff, but they're not going to know, say, Moon Knight or Night Thrasher or some of the lower level,
the ones that don't get their own movies.
the ones that haven't had movies yet. I mean, maybe there will be at some point.
A Night Thrasher, that would be cool.
That'll be all right.
Okay, so you're saying that these characters are gonna last, or they're not gonna last. Like, do you think that, looking back in the past, have they had a long run? Could it keep going? Like,
yeah, I mean, I think it could definitely keep going. I know that people are starting to get exhausted with superhero movies.
Yeah.
Which is just something as a 13-year-old I just never ever would have dreamed was coming, because as good as it got when I was 13 was the Spawn movie, which was just utter trash.
Right.
But I think that they'll continue to be profitable. Will these movies, will Marvel continue as the juggernaut in the film studios that it is now? I mean, I think I don't know if this kind of power is tenable, but will this stuff maybe creep back up? Will it, in 20 years from now, will it ebb and flow like it has? I think almost certainly, yeah.
It's very interesting too to me to see how both the use of like classic tropes in comic books. So we see the recycling. I mentioned it just briefly, Jekyll and Hyde, because my favorite detective I read a lot of crime novels. Detective Rebus is like he is Jekyll and Hyde.
Okay.
He's this which is the classic detective trope, right? He's a two-faced detective. Sometimes he's doing illegal.
Like Dirty Harry's one person during the day, someone else at night.
Totally, and we see this in the Hulk, and so some of these things are recycled myths that we've had for centuries.
Yeah.
And some of them, like Spider-Man, we see a change. He used to be, in the movies at least, he used to be this like teenage boy, and now he's like a doctor or something. Like he's developed.
Steven, you need to watch more movies.
I know.
He's a teenage boy again, I promise.
Oh, he is?
Yeah.
I haven't been to the pictures in a while.
Did you just call them the pictures? the talkies? Haven't seen any talkies in a while?
The moving images, yeah.
So, well, Spider-Man is a good example of someone who's been recycled. At this point in film, he's being played by a guy named Tom Holland, who is 25 going on 15 or something.
It's not Gyllenhaal anymore?
He's actually playing Mysterio in the upcoming who's a villain. Yeah, who's playing but Jake Gyllenhaal has never been Superman or Spider-Man.
No?
No.
Tobey Maguire.
Tobes.
Oh, he's close to Gyllenhaal.
I mean, he's a white guy with brown hair.
Okay, yes, I need to brush up on my superhero.
You are talking to a pop culture enthusiast here.
Yeah, so Spider-Man's come full circle then. He was never.
I mean, he like Spider-Man at this point. Like, there's a movie that's coming out. It's an animated feature called Enter the Spider-Verse or something like that. At this point, there are like 17 Spider-Mans, something like that. There's Miles Morales. There's Spider-Gwen. There's Spider-Pig. Don't ask. There's a whole world of Spider characters. So Peter Parker. They can continue to play with him, but that whole universe is.
Do other pop culture movements or pop culture mediums enjoy this kind of freedom where anyone can be like, my little nephew is Iron Man. When he puts on that suit, he becomes Iron Man. Yeah, like, he doesn't care about the backstory.
That's fine. I mean, it's a pretty dark backstory. I don't know if he needs to know it. So wait, what's your question?
So like you study pop culture broadly, cultural history.
Yeah.
Are other mediums sort of this moldable? Because it seems like there's this freedom in these characters that we can kind of twist them and turn them and produce anything. Like, because that's one of the reasons it's getting so big, is because we have Wonder Woman now, and we have Black Panther, and it's appealing to all these different groups.
Wonder Woman being DC, of course.
Just calling me out today.
Just going full nerd. If I'm gonna, you might as well lean into it.
Whatever, the Batman.
the Batty Man.
But is it possible in other popular culture mediums to transfer?
Well, you know what that makes me think of. So for one, to answer your question, I think that comic book heroes are particularly well suited for that kind of reinvention, right? And of course we see reinvention, and if you take like the Lord of the Rings, for instance, they were reinvented in the characters in different ways, some drastic, some not very drastically. But I'd say that every medium is is capable of doing this. What it makes me think of is you and I talking off microphone recently about the movie. What's the P.T. Barnum picture with?
Oh, The Greatest Show with Hugh Jackman.
Yeah.
Sorry, Australians.
One and the same. Which I have not seen. But I have not seen it because I simply know too much about P.T. Barnum to watch a movie where he's celebrated as some sort of hero. Yeah. So
even with Zac Efron, still not enough to see the movie.
I mean, all I need to do is just Google like his smile and just feel his glow coming off me. I don't need to watch a movie for that necessarily. Just look up any meme.
No, but even moving forward with that sort of thing is like, does this devalue us as historians a little bit? That these myth tellers, the Greatest Showman, because it has Hugh Jackman and Zac Efron. It's they're saying screw the P.T. Barnum story, and they're actually turning it around to make it a very positive thing.
Right.
It does this challenge us as historians?
Well, yeah, I mean it definitely does, but I mean that's always been the challenge. So I'm particularly interested in the nexus between history and film.
Okay.
And one of the most influential films of all time would be The Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith, right? You're familiar, but for those who are not, it is a black and white picture from 1919 or so, around there. Don't quote me on that. But in short, it is the South redeemed, Ku Klux Klan as heroes, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a wildly influential movie. It helped reinstate the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, it reinvigorated interest in the Ku Klux Klan. And we are still living in the shadow of this movie, trying to beat down the fiction that it presented to people 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So I'd say we're always pushing against that because people, I mean, they're a lot less likely to read a book than they are to watch a movie at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And unfortunately,
that's why we're unfortunately so unfun to hang out.
There's many reasons why historians aren't fun to hang out with, but that's one of them.
There's many reasons we're fun to hang out with as well.
We are doing karaoke later. That's fun.
No, and so it has an important. I don't know. Let's go back for a second to Stan Lee. Let's go back to Marvel and talk about sort of the cultural impact. So he sees it becomes big in the 60s. Can we sort of trace it through up to present day? Because I think there's sort of an unequal balance. Like he really sort of hit his stride in his 80s and 90s when it's being reborn in film, right?
Well, again, he didn't actually have a lot to do with these movies. He's listed as the executive producer on a lot of them, if not all of them. But that's only because he's I'm not sure what the propriety kind of thing is like when after things calmed down between him and Disney and Stanley Media dissolved. He's tried this other thing called POW Media, and then he kind of went back to Marvel again. So I'm not sure what level of ownership he had of the characters once he rejoined Marvel. But he didn't actually have a lot to do with these movies. I mean, what his main job was in his 80s and 90s was kind of what it was throughout much of his career, which was ambassador, face of the industry, face of Marvel Comics, right? So that's partly how he ends up entering the public consciousness and getting credit for things that he didn't necessarily
And was he
do.
in charge in the 70s? And was he in charge through the development? Or
In Marvel, yeah. I mean, it's funny. Stan Lee started at Marvel, they say, the same day that Captain America came out. At that point, though, he was a gopher. He was just fetching coffee and that kind of stuff. But there was
back when there was no TaskRabbit.
Yeah, no. So it was 1941 or something. Maybe even 1940. So he starts pretty young, but it's like a skeleton crew, and very early on, he's like put in charge. By the third issue of Captain America, he's already contributing to it. In fact, I think it was him that came up with the idea of the shield like coming back. That whole thing when the Cap throws it.
Wait a sec. Captain America's not DC?
Oh, just stop. So he kind of slowly raised through the ranks. But in the 1950s, when this big scare about comics came out, the industry just like folded. Like it was just done. There was practically like almost everybody was fired from from Marvel. Lots of comics closed their doors industries closed their doors for good. But he was one of the few remaining people left standing, and he was given like all this power that he just like no one cared. They were like, wow. They're like comics are done, Marvel's done, do whatever you want. Like, so he had this very creative burst in the 60s, working with people like Steve Ditko and Joe Kirby and Joe Simon, and of course a few other people. His brother Larry Lieber was pretty influential in Marvel as well, and in creating all these characters. And then he just kind of stepped back, and after he wrote and edited and did a lot of stuff. But throughout, by the time the 70s, 80s came, he was mostly like touring campuses and like giving talks and being like Excelsior, and which I say that like it, but that was kind of what he did. Like I mean, he had an editorial column in Marvel Comics, and he would just kind of talk to people. He would write about what's on his mind, often very like progressive kind of like equal rights kind of ideas, and he would bandy that kind of stuff about. So he had his run, but for most of, I mean, like Marvel went bankrupt in the mid-late 90s, and at that so he's kind of, and then he left, and then he kind of came back. At one point, he was only expected to spend 10% of his time there. So while he's always been the face of Marvel, in reality, like how much contribution he has very much fluctuated.
It's really interesting. That's kind of like why his story is an inspiration and such a like cool thing, is this idea that you can, especially when people don't believe in a product anymore.
Right.
Like it seems to me like Stan Lee had a vision, and he didn't write the next great American novel, but he persisted with what he was doing. He had a goal, and he continued doing it. And even the bankruptcy, like it's like you can get so close. People see comics now and think, "Oh, what a massive industry!" And,
right.
This legend is dying. But when you dig down and see the story, it's not that simple.
Yeah, it hasn't always been the juggernaut that it was. Pun not intended. But yeah, he.
So he's a good. I mean, and 95 years old is an incredible.
It's a nice long life.
Incredible life.
But it's sad. He really, when it's ironic and sad because at the end of his life, when things you'd think would be going the best for him in terms of like his. I mean, at least with all the movies going on and stuff, right? Like you'd think that he's seen his vision realized and being confirmed that his belief that yes, this stuff is absolutely accessible to like the entire globe and will speak to all kinds of people and uplift them. And as that went on, his personal life was, I mean, like his last years were just utter chaos, just sad chaos, people bilking him out of money, allegations against his business partners and his family at some points. I don't know how true they all are. Yeah. At one point, one of his business associates stole blood from this man in his 90s and used it to auto-sign copies of Black Panther and editions of the book Black Panther and sell it. So literally his blood is being stolen from him and profited from. So like he really did not have. Yeah. And then there was sexual abuse allegations made against him, which we're not sure how founded those actually were. It's just like his final years were just a really tragic mess. It's really sad.
It's interesting. Like we have this sort of like monolithic view of these people. They get this great obituary and presumably they're millionaires, and we think, wow, this person has everything. But You don't have to dig very far to find suffering.
Yeah. No.
That's very interesting. Someone else who recently turned 90 that I hoped we could talk about is Mickey Mouse.
Oh, yeah. Or Mortimer Mouse, as he was almost known.
Mortimer, that
would not have flown, right?
Flown.
Luckily, Walt Disney's wife, whose name escapes me at the moment, she talked him out of it and suggested Mickey, and he was like, "Yeah, okay, that works."
Oh man, I had no idea. Yeah, so he's recently turned 90. I think it was very close around Stan Lee's death, actually, that people were tweeting and saying, the mouse is 90, celebration, and
it almost seems like he'd be older. You know what I mean? He seems like forever.
It's 1928.
Okay.
And so, let's talk a little bit about Disney. We've mentioned it a little bit in passing before as sort of this corporation that is buying Marvel. They've bought Star Wars. They're swallowing up everything. They're going to create their own Netflix, and because all I want to do is see the Star Wars movies. Disney has them. They release like the new ones on Netflix. I'm like, come on, just put everyone out there.
Just put the old ones on there without the CGI updates, right? That's all anybody wants. But no. Disney behemoth that it is just growing in stature. Yeah, and one of the places that they're growing fastest, surprisingly enough, isn't even in their films. It's in their theme parks. The theme park plans that they have, like they're making Star Wars World right now, and their plans in the near future are they expect to make more money from their theme parks than from anywhere else.
It's extraordinary, and there's Shanghai Disney, but not only that, Disney in China, which I have to bring up every episode because you have
to bring up China.
China. It would be irresponsible of historians not to talk about China.
Sure.
Is English. Disney teaches English in China too, and to a great number of people. And so this is a company that's great at diversifying their sources of income. Theme parks seem to be doing relatively well.
Sure.
Is it good for popular culture? Have we seen these kind of mega corporations in the past, or mega cultural institutions?
I mean, it's kind of like this, it seems almost like there should be like these trust issues somewhere in here, right? Like monopoly issues almost, but
is this unprecedented? Like, I watched Greatest Showman, and P.T. Barnum seemed to have a good handle on the New York circus scene.
I mean, he did. I mean, the Keith Albee's the theaters, for instance, had a pretty good lock on. But okay, so I mean, the difference, I guess, that if anyone comparable, it wouldn't be in today's dollars, and more so than that, it wouldn't be in today's global reach, right? Because anyone else that we compare, I mean, we're probably not talking about a global audience like with Disney.
So Disney might. Is this the thing that's going to undo nationalism? Like, just corporate consuming? Like, it seems like everyone.
Can you imagine?
The mouse.
Unbridled capitalism undoing nationalism.
I mean, there's famous stories of Hitler denouncing, or at least Hitler's propaganda corps denouncing the mouse because of the way the Nazis were portrayed in Disney comics, and so.
Although I think he may have been a fan prior to,
and then he came out and he said, this is the lowest creature, that spreads disease and filth, and you should have swastikas. And
are we talking about Hitler?
Hitler.
I'm saying this is the lowest creature that spreads disease and filth. Okay.
He didn't see.
Low hanging fruit. Stick around for more punches at dictators. All right, keep going.
No, but it's true. Could Mickey and could these superheroes become the sort of one thing that people can unify around? Like, let's talk a little bit about popular culture bringing America together, maybe, or bringing the world together. How does popular culture seem to unify, or is it just divisive? Like in the case of the birth of a nation and the expansion of the KKK.
I don't think it's divisive. I think it's for the most part it creates cohesion, right? I mean, people that have nothing in common might find that they really enjoy the show The Office, and all of a sudden there's a lot you could talk about there and just have a good time. So I mean, people, I think that that kind of stuff brings nations and people closer, absolutely. Now, it can create division too. We talked a little bit last time about the controversy surrounding Star Wars of late because they dare to put women in them, I guess, is the problem.
Well, and that one commander was totally inexplicable. What was her name?
What, Captain Phasma?
Yeah, the purple one.
Oh, you talking about Laura Dern's character?
Yeah.
What more did you need about her? Did we have a lot of backstory about Admiral Akbar in the first movies?
No.
Don't get me started. All right?
Yeah, no, I want to get you started. So there's clearly there's a division here.
I mean, you can find division, right?
Yeah.
And Star Wars, I think particularly, you can find people that take the opposite message, right? That's intended and end up drawing something else from that, and you see that with Marvel and stuff too. Like I often find on Twitter, there'll be like some troll who is espousing very extreme far right kind of hate filled rhetoric, and then they'll have like the Punisher's logo for their picture, or like Cap in America or something like that, and you're like, do you know anything about these people? Because you seem to be just fixating on one aspect of it and running with it. So those kind of divisions will exist. But I mean, I think generally speaking, pop culture does a good job in bringing people together. Yeah.
It's a force for good.
I believe so, yeah.
And
yeah, because all popular culture is the art that people are generally excited about, and that sounds like a good thing.
Yeah, I've noticed in a lot of Marvel films, there's this catering to China. China seems to be the biggest consumer now of superhero films and things like that. So you always
America still is, but after that, probably China.
I don't know. Is there like pushback against this, or is there no real rift?
I don't think there's a real rift.
Huh.
I mean, you and I talked last time about like the main thing that we see is like locations, that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, I don't think that Americans at least seem to have a real issue with seeing their superheroes in foreign locations like that.
And how about the arming or the using? You mentioned a little bit with Punisher and the meme sort of for the right, and Trump became Pepe the Frog, and the cartoonist who had drawn that said, I'm not okay with you guys using Pepe.
Yeah.
But I don't even think he was called Pepe originally.
He wasn't. No.
He wasn't. He was just a frog.
He was just one character of many, I think.
Now, well, is this the future of this sort of thing? Like,
it's
are we going to?
It's already been happening.
It's always.
One of my favorite comics of all time is Bill Watterson's Calvin and Hobbes. And Bill Watterson stopped doing Calvin and Hobbes exactly the same time people started having pictures of Calvin pissing on people, or pissing like on the Ford logo,
really,
and that kind of stuff, and like spring break partying stickers and T-shirts and that kind of stuff. The copyright law just for whatever reason just decided like this character was too vague and people could play with it enough, and he was just like, I'm done. You've perverted this character that I loved and that I myself personally loved.
And was that the reason?
That's why he stopped.
Wow.
Yeah, that's why he stopped.
I remember as a child. So my brother is a huge fan of Calvin and Hobbes,
As am I.
So I grew up with these comics and everything, and I would see those stickers and just think like that's not. It's
a
Calvin.
perversion, right?
Yeah.
And that's why he stopped. So you're always going to have like characters when they enter the public domain. Which is not to say like in the legal sense, but in how like they become like everyone feels like they own such and such character if they feel like a personal connection. That reinterpretation can be very ugly and inappropriate.
Yeah, that's a shame when that kind of thing happens.
It really is, but it's something you're going to find that no matter what.
It happens with historical figures too.
Absolutely.
Like we see these battles over legacies.
Generally, anybody?
Yeah, seriously. So we've done comics, we've done Disney. I want to get more into Star Wars since you teased me a little bit.
Oh shit! Because now I have to like sound like I know what I'm talking about.
No. But Star Wars fans are known for being the world's most aggressive and angry. Was it Jake Lloyd was young Anakin?
Poor man.
He was young Anakin. And so this happens at a formidable time in my childhood. He's young Anakin, and he is teased relentlessly by internet crowds. He ends his acting career. There's no more Jake Lloyd after young Anakin.
He had some personal struggles.
Hayden Christensen he's
who is
Anakin.
A fine actor. If you've ever seen the film Life is a House,
Hayden Christensen?
Yeah, there's a film, one of his earliest movies is called Life is a House, and with Kevin Kline, and it's just an absolutely beautiful movie. And like he was a fine actor, but
another case.
But he threw up his hands and like, people are mean as hell. And
he said no.
And who could blame him?
Yeah.
You know? So Star Wars fans can be particularly vicious for whatever reason. And I think that comes from a sense of, like, there's a sense of entitlement there. And there's this sense of, like...
What do you mean, entitlement?
Like, this is mine. I grew up with this. This is mine.
But I did.
And everyone feels that way, right? Like,
yeah.
I was watching Harry and the Hendersons for, like, the 9 millionth time the other day. And as I was watching it with a group of friends who had also seen it a million times, but I had never watched it with them. And we're all like quoting the movie and saying the same parts. And I'm sitting there reflecting to myself of like, when I grew up watching this movie, this felt like it only played in my house. You know, we had a VHS copy of it, and it felt like it was just mine and my family's, and like all those jokes and all those moments were just for us, right? Which of course was not the truth. But that's kind of how you can feel sometimes. And you take something like Star Wars with these huge themes. And a very passionate fan base, especially when, like, because we're living in the age of the nerd, we forget that, like, there was a very long stretch where you were shunned and shamed for liking things like comic books and Star Wars. So it made you dig and entrench in even more into those kinds of things and maybe be a little bitter.
And I think people also forget we were growing up or in the age of the VHS where we watched the same movies every day.
Oh my God.
Because we only had like a certain amount of movies. Right. So it was like, let's just watch our favorite one over and over.
Or even not your favorite one. I think I watched the movie Diggstown like 600 times in my life, but it's not a great movie.
No. Because we just didn't have the selection. But
right.
that breeds a kind of loyalty and just to this.
It does. I watched Diggstown the other night. Thought to myself, this is not a good movie. But I had that same like nostalgic thing going for it. So like, yeah, that's
interesting. That time,
which goes back to that limited choice thing.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
There's too many choices, and you end up something might have an effect on you emotionally, but you may not absorb it and personalize it and make it your own the same way.
Well, but I also think that might be a problem because like when we're talking about Netflix now. There's a lot of good series I've seen, but I'm not tied to them. Like I watched Star Wars all the time, and then I would read about Star Wars and think about Star Wars when I was not watching Star Wars as a child. And now, I mean, it's like, let's marathon Narcos, and then the next week we'll marathon Black Mirror. And you can see I don't watch a lot of shows because I've referenced those ones repeatedly.
Black Mirror is very good. I've never actually seen Narcos.
But there's no like sort of, I'm not going to watch them again. Once I've got to the ending, it's like there's so much else to consume.
Right. There's always like there's your watch list or whatever. There's always like this growing list of things that you feel like you should be watching. Yeah. Especially if they have like these cultural touchstones, and everyone starts asking like, you haven't seen such and such. Yeah, but I think that is that going to change? How could that change popular culture? Because I'm thinking like Mickey exists because everyone saw Mickey all the time, right? And
like the Mickey watch became something that you had to have. Like people had the Mickey watch, and but there's no sort of homogeneity around cultural consumption anymore.
I think that part of it, and I'm thinking this as we're talking, this is necessarily something I'm generally thinking about.
Also, full disclaimer, this is not what historians do, peer into the future.
Yeah. But I think a lot of it may be hinged on the fact that we don't own things now. When I was growing up, I had hundreds of VHS tapes. Bought, like copied, not burned, but like copied.
Strike
burned,
that.
That would mean actually lighting them on fire at that time. Copied, but I had just volumes of cassette tapes posted on my wall that I had like on display, that kind of stuff.
A cassette was like a
for those of you who don't know, or books, for instance. Like I have a large library, and I still resist getting digital books because I want to own them. And I think that there's something to be said about, and I feel like we may have talked about this last time too, so hopefully we're not repeating ourselves too much.
So, yeah.
But like vinyl has made a big comeback lately, because people want to own stuff. I mean, people would almost rather pay more sometimes than only stream things, because that streaming, especially if it's something you have like this personal connection to, it's not the same as holding that item in your hand and saying, I own this.
Yeah. And there's something like super human about that. Like, I'm not saying we have to be irresponsible in the way we consume. And in the episode, Mana and I talk about like being conscious about how we're consuming. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there is something like distinctly human about that ownership.
Yeah.
That is just like so gratifying.
Right, and that gets to where like that, in part, like why Star Wars is so important. People grew up with those VHS tapes, you know. People grew up with VHS tapes of Romancing the Stone too, and they might not have that same level of attachment, but I think that's part of it.
But it has to be thoughtful. I think that's something we lose too now, not only in streaming but in the way we consume. In the way we consume, like even for the Star Wars, the re-releases of the old trilogy. Like, there was so much buildup because it had been a decade since those movies came out. So the Taco Bell had those Star Wars toys for maybe years. Yeah. Maybe years they had the toys before the release.
Right.
And there's just so much anticipation, and that anticipation is like half of the fun. And then you're always thinking about Star Wars. You're always thinking about these little toys that you get. And then Star Wars comes out, and then there's not another Star Wars for like another 3 years. Whereas now it's like a movie drops in February, the next one's out in March, the next one, you know.
So, like, oversaturation maybe, which is what the studio felt like they learned with the movie Solo, which was a good movie, but
I heard it shouldn't have been released.
Well, you heard wrong. But I think that gets at something, sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So maybe we should be slower in our consume, or you'd think capitalism would figure that out, but
in a way it does. I mean, you referenced Stranger Things earlier.
Yeah.
Stranger Things came out on Netflix, along with a plethora of other crap that happened to be
a la Netflix.
It happened to be all Netflix because Netflix is big on just kind of releasing stuff. Now, Stranger Things was obviously a tier above in terms of quality. But it's not like they didn't actually advertise for it that hard. But very quickly it gained strong word of mouth. And I think that word of mouth... So while there might not be... there might be so many choices now that some things get lost. But on the other hand, there's like these cultural moments that end up being very much focused upon. Like the film Get Out came out last year. Or was it... Yeah, it was early.
It was last year, yeah.
It was early 2018 or late 20...
It must have been last year.
It must have been last year because it was nominated for Academy Award. So that, for instance, could have just kind of been a blip or whatever, but since it was so good, the word of mouth picked up for it and everybody kind of latched on. So that, I think... So the cream of the crop might unite people now as opposed to like the mass oversaturation, like...
So it's almost
I Love Lucy.
So it's almost like purer then, or we're getting a better quality. Like, would you go that far?
I don't know that necessarily. I mean, like zeitgeist kind of more of a thing. Like it might not necessarily be good, but usually I think yeah. I mean, the stuff that people like, it's pretty rare that something takes off and becomes like this cultural fascination without having some value to it, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. What I've been really fond of is the way international cultural films have also moved to the U.S. Mm-hmm. It's globalized, to use a word that is now a dirty word in the U.S. among some communities. It has globalized America because Americans, I in middle school, I was very strange because I listened to Japanese rock. Now, if you're a middle schooler who listens to Japanese music, you're probably not that weird. Because it's just flows, the global flows are so connected,
Yeah, the market is smaller, the world is smaller, and if we feel more connected to our neighboring countries and stuff like that through there. I mean, like, so much of American might comes from our cultural
absolutely
exports, right? So like for you to feel closer to Japanese culture because you grew up listening to certain Japanese bands,
yeah,
like that's just the same thing that's been going on all over the globe. Only now it's actually starting to maybe filter into the U.S. some, and so you have since like The Ring and that kind of stuff, you have like a renewed interest in Japanese horror or French horror, or I could talk about horror all day because that's one of my favorite subjects.
All right, yeah. Or like I'm reading Scottish crime novels. Not to say American ones aren't good, and some awesome writers are coming out of Belfast in Northern Ireland. Like totally unrelated, but for whatever reason, I can't read crime in my own town. If I read a Philly crime novel, I would be scared so much, but I can read it in Glasgow, no problem. I can read it in Edinburgh or
But I imagine you're also like getting some of the stuff that's popular there.
Totally.
And maybe
music,
there's a reason why it's getting popular.
Movies and everything,
right.
So it's cool.
Yeah. So the world is getting smaller, but
I think this
gets back to that uniting idea we were talking about.
Yeah, and this might be our saving grace. Like we're talking about an age where people are kind of hopeless, depressed, sad,
Sure.
Broke. But there is this international connection that's unlike anything we've ever seen.
Yeah, people are getting more, and that creates empathy for each other, right? I mean, we live in a time where, like, obviously, like, hate and authoritarianism have been raising their heads, but the coverage of that is also heightened too. And I like to believe, and maybe I'm just fooling myself, but I think that most people generally have empathy for others, and I think that's a lot of times like if you grow up in some small town where it's all the same religion, all the same race, all the same whatever, in that case, that's what happened with me. Yeah. The only outside contact that you're really going to have is through culture, is through popular culture. So like, I didn't meet or know really any black people, for instance, until I was in my early 20s. Wow. So, which is significant.
It is, yeah.
And prior to that point, because I come from a very small rural town, and prior to that point, like, I really liked the band Living Colour, for instance, and and like, so like, all right, so I'm kind of diverging a little bit, but these connections get created in ways that people need.
But is this why Stan Lee was able to sort of do this thing? Like, is this a symptom of our urban-rural divide? Like, Stan Lee is a product of the city. He's in Manhattan in the 1940s when Manhattan is less segregated than maybe any place in the United States.
Well, you know what he did do? Is that he made Manhattan a character. He made New York a character. He made Hell's Kitchen a character. It wasn't like D.C. with Metropolis and Gotham and these stand-in places. He made the universe. I know, every time I'm on here. But he made this universe, like, real. So it wasn't just the characters that he made more realistic, it was the locations. So, I mean, I don't know if that really...
No, it's important, but I'm kind of saying, like, I'm kind of getting at this urban-rural divide that's being cracked down. With technology, there's... The youth, at least in rural places, has access to urban thought.
Well, yeah, now, and again, so that very much breaks down that divide. When I was a kid growing up in the middle of nowhere, we didn't have MTV until I was 13 or something, and it was a really big deal when we got it. And all of a sudden, I could see the outside world because I got cable.
A whole lot of stuff.
Right. In the early 90s and late 80s, when I was coming up, like anything that wasn't in your town, you probably weren't really seeing or hearing about. I mean, of course you get albums.
Yeah. But that's a significant change in our world, and I think it's a change
for the better.
For the positive. Right?
I think so too. Which is partly why I so focused. I mean, on popular culture as a historical.
No, I'm all about it. I never thought I would study cultural history, but I'm getting sucked in.
I didn't think that I would take it seriously because most of my work has been, as you know, in environmental history, and like that came from a very like doomsday kind of mentality where I'm like, well, all of humanity is going to die because we're killing ourselves and putting ourselves to this we're going to kill off all the animals and put ourselves through our own extinction level event. So it's probably a good idea if we track this. And that was basically my mentality when I started getting behind that
culture
stuff.
Rather than money.
Yeah.
That's interesting because a lot of people end up saying, well, the bottom line is the economy. People are trying to make money,
and of course that's there.
That's true. Yeah.
Sure, but
culture drives the economy
first, right? Yes, And what is culture but a collection of psyches in like acting together, right? Because I mean, historians I think should be most interested in people. Above all, we're like interested in the human race, the civilization, and like that kind of stuff. So when we look at popular culture, it's a way of tracking how we feel as people over time, and as opposed to what we say we're feeling. You can kind of get more of a sense of what we're actually feeling.
Yeah.
The fact that...
And the way we're feeling controls the way we act, the way we consume. Yeah.
Exactly. And so much of what historians do are is trying to get at motivators, right? The root causes of things, causality, more specifically. And I think that can, often be... That's usually like an emotional thing more than a logical thing. And since it's an emotional thing, it may not be in print anywhere. Like if your subject is such and such person, they may not write things down about themselves, what they're thinking, but they may really get okay. So my interest in Walt Disney comes from, in part, this firm belief, this knowledge. I know it, that his films, the natural documentaries that he made, that anthropomorphized animals and presented them to people in a very sentimental way. I know that affected how people approached animals, and it affected how nature documentaries were made, and it affected all these stuff, and that's how you get to this point where in the 1970s, this man named Noel Marshall, who was a Hollywood agent turned film producer, he actually produced the movie The Exorcist and a few other movies. He was married to Tippi Hedren, who you may be familiar with. She starred in The Birds. With Alfred Hitchcock, big 60s, 70s
I'm a
actors.
birder, so I don't endorse that movie.
Well, the two of them made this film called Roar. And Roar it was filmed over roughly 5 to 11 years. And what they did is they had about 150 big cats, like tigers, lions, pumas, etc.
Jaguars?
Sure, all of the above, on a game preserve, on a preserve in Acton, California, and they filmed a movie there with these untrained animals. These were not wild animals, but they were untrained animals. And this film is just, one guy had his neck sliced right next to his jugular. The Noel Marshall himself got so many cuts and bites that he went to the hospital numerous times for gangrene. The cinematographer Jan de Bont, who went on to direct Speed and Twister, he was scalped by a lion. It's the most dangerous film shoot in history, and the whole movie is Noel Marshall just running around it's just utter chaos. It's just like 30 lions in one scene climbing all over Melanie Griffith, who was also in this movie because she's Tippi Hedren's daughter. It's just utter chaos, and it's violence, and it's supposed to be. But the movie is filmed with this glowing soundtrack, etc. And it's supposed to be we should respect lions, we should respect nature, etc., etc. I think there's a direct line between Noel Marshall filming this movie and the Disneyfied version of nature that he probably grew up watching, right? You don't just start interacting with lions and calling them your buddy and your friend. He says that the lions co-wrote the movie because they just let them do whatever they wanted to do and just splice the stuff together later. I mean, I could go on about Roar for a while, but
it seems important. It's so funny. I'm thinking of all these videos I've seen recently, this girl who goes down to get a selfie with a shark, and the shark just drags her into the water. And it's just we're at that point in humanity where we're so out of touch with what nature actually is. Right.
And I think that's partly Walt Disney himself, who we can thank for that, because he gave us an appreciation for nature, but he normalized this narrative flow in nature documentaries that made people start to apply human logic to animals that is not there.
It's just not there.
Yeah.
And we love to do that.
Oh yeah.
We do that across the animal kingdom.
Sure.
But a bird, so I studied in great detail my master's thesis. Now I'm fully geeking out.
Do it.
Horace Alexander, who was a Quaker philanthropist teacher. Not philanthropist, really, because he had no money. He was like a humanitarian.
Okay.
But he was a birder, an avid birder, and he would write. One time I read this striking letter where he said, like, I spend too much time checking my own appearance. Does the pelican think about its feathers as it's diving for its meal?
It surely does not.
It surely does not. And then, we kind of like think that now. Like, we've so put animals on our same.
Yeah, I mean, look at how Americans treat dogs, for instance. And I say this as a dog owner and dog lover.
Corgi, not just dog.
I have a corgi and a terrier mix.
Yeah.
But like, there's recently this week there was an article saying that, like, it turns out there's a scientific study that says that dogs are no more exceptional than any other animal in the animal kingdom. And people like universally are like, no,
you're wrong.
Like, fuck you for saying that. Like, how dare you? I think it's Scientific American that released it, I want to say. And people are just like,
that's just wrong. It's
no, and I'm not saying that's based solely on like growing up with Walt Disney like pictures. It's going to be based more on your experience with your dogs. But I mean, people tend to project on what they don't understand, and then if you include with that again, like this narrative focused idea when it comes to animals, when you watch documentaries and that kind of stuff, you start to think of them as something other than what they are.
Which is like the dogs, if we can dwell there for just a second,
sure,
has really replaced, in the cities at least, the human.
I wish that were true. I don't agree with that statement.
You don't think so?
No. I wish that were true.
I mean,
like
come on.
so
What do you
much
see in, like, if you go to I don't even know the nice areas of Philadelphia because I live in Fishtown where people don't have dogs. No, but if you go Rittenhouse Square,
yeah,
and you're gonna see people walking their dogs,
sure,
and like these are people who are not having children because they're having dogs, they're treating this dog like a child.
Yeah. I'm waiting for the problem to come. Like, where's the problem in this?
So you think this is a good thing?
I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but I say this is someone who has no intention of having children, but intends on having lots of dogs. This is not history anymore. I apologize.
No, but we're onto popular culture, sure, and we're onto the dog, and we're onto like this sort of like idealization of animals, yeah, like the happy feet penguin. Penguins would, I mean, the penguin he tries to kill the Batman.
Okay, now I feel like you're just stretching to get us back to comics. But yeah, the anthropomorphization of animals.
Is it dangerous or is it positive? Because I feel like it's good. We need people to learn about animals so we don't.
It's not. It's more nuanced than that. It can't be. I can't just say it's one or the other. Of course, I mean there is only gray. But I mean, on one hand, when I think of like the role that Walt Disney's True Life Adventure Nature documentary had an influence, and it wasn't just him; it was also Jacques Cousteau and some other people, but mainly him. That the role that those films had in sentimentalizing, if that's really a word, but it's not. But you know what I'm saying?
No.
Nature for people. I mean, a lot of our conservation efforts in the 20th century come from this faulty view of animals, or at least a romantic view of animals, but at least animals are being saved, right? On the other hand, you're going to have things like a lack of understanding of animals, so you end up with like the motion picture Roar, or you have undue focus given to cute animals and not, say, the mud skipper or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, you're going to have there's reports recently that like there are some parts of the world that are reporting like a 75% loss in insects right now. Just insects generally. That is terrifying. But
it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary the loss of biodiversity that you go through places in Europe and there is no wildlife in Europe anymore.
That's very strange.
Like nothing at all. I mean, I was just recently reading about the wolf, the gray wolf in
Which
America.
Is back off the endangered list. Thank you so much, Trump administration.
But like, what does the future hold for these animals and for us?
I don't think it holds much for them.
Yeah.
I'm sad to say. The blue macaw went extinct recently, right?
Is there a potential for popular culture to come to the aid of this, or is it doomed to like not to get too far off topic, but talking with Mana, I was saying, like, when I was an undergrad, they were saying Aung San Suu Kyi is going to save Myanmar, and now when I'm a graduate student, they're saying she's leading a genocide.
Right. Things change drastically.
Is there a hope for popular culture to help animals? Or
I think it already has, in that it has created concern that otherwise might not have been there. I think the 20th century, despite its many failings when it comes to animal conservation, which are legion, I think it would be even worse had it not been for the influence of Walt Disney and other nature documentarians. Yeah. Now, there is, like, you think of, like, Planet Earth and that kind of stuff. Netflix has another Richard Attenborough series coming out soon that's going to be similar to Planet Earth. That kind of stuff, these big budget... what have you?
Films,
I mean, on one hand, they're going to maybe create concern about wild spaces and preserving them, and that can't hurt. Worst case scenario, they become documentation of what used to be.
That word "preserve" scares me. It's a word that Hitler used with the Jews, and that
are you comparing me to Hitler right now?
No, more or less.
You're the one with the mustache.
No, but I have a very full mustache that curves around.
For those of you at home.
Yeah. No, the preserve creates fear with me, because I do think that, like, this idea, it's the same, like, gray area of sustainability. It kind of means, like, we are not the problem. Like, let's just put them off to the side and it's okay. And, like, if we cut off these areas...
I mean, but is that really a terrible idea to, like, say, just leave the Everglades alone and let animals have it?
Well, but I would disagree with this alone. Like I drove through the Everglades. Actually, it's one of my crowning achievements this year. Like, a memory I have. I went down to Miami to do my Cuba stuff, and I cut across the Everglades. And I was thinking about these kind of things the whole time. If you ever need to think, like, you should think about the road as you're driving, but also take a long drive.
Oh yeah, it's great for that.
And I was going across the Everglades, and it's beautifully uninhibited and inhabited. And but the puma doesn't stop. The puma doesn't know where the Everglades stop. The Florida panther, doesn't know. And so, like, Florida panthers still, like, go into people's backyards in South Florida, and, like, it's wild.
I mean, you're gonna have that anywhere, unfortunately. I mean, like, because animals don't know the limits that we put on them, the boundaries that we think are important, right? So,
but in the Avatar world, they coexist.
The film Avatar, James Cameron's own. That is truly pop cultural history.
No, they see each other.
I'm more of a Fern Gully man, so you're.
Oh no! No, but really, it's not possible the coexistence, huh? Humans are a species that necessitate preserve.
Wait, you're saying it's not possible for humans to live?
Like, do we have to have a space like the Everglades? Like, it's not.
Don't we? I mean,
we kind of have to.
I think we absolutely have to. I mean, bear ears is getting dismantled, like, this week, right?
Yeah.
All kinds of these things are like, these natural preserves are being reduced. I think it's more important than ever to hold on to these wild spaces.
Like, can we recreate a wild space? Like,
we can't recreate a wild space, but we can leave one that's already in existence well enough alone.
But there's not many.
Sure, no, there is not many. All the more reason to preserve those that are there.
And like the Amazon, though, Brazil has recently elected a government that has no interest in preserving the Amazon.
Brazil has recently elected a government that has no interest in a lot of things.
Yeah. I mean, they just sent like 5,000 free doctors from Cuba home. But anyway, but what is the world to do? Because we have no right or control under this Western system of sovereignty. I can't tell a Brazilian what to do.
Well, I mean, America. God, I sound like, I don't even know what I sound like when I say this, but It used to be a beacon of hope. It used to be, we lead by example, et cetera, et cetera. And, when I say that, that's totally dismissing the absolute horrors that America has engaged in with Central America and elsewhere and so on and so forth. But I do still kind of believe that America can at least lead other countries by its example. And that, that's what sovereignty is about. I mean, we can't make these other countries care, but we can show them that we care, which we've not been doing a very good job of doing, especially of late. But
we have to. And one of the most happy memories I have in my life is seeing eagles in the wild.
That's awesome.
And I've seen them in Philadelphia, and I've seen them in New Jersey.
You saw wild eagles in Philadelphia?
Yes.
That's awesome.
John Hines Reservoir. Actually, it's right by the airport. It's fantastic. And they nest there, wild. And these are no longer American bald eagles, though they are bald eagles, because they all went to Nova Scotia, because we had no environmental regulations.
Right.
Until the 1970s, late 70s, when Carter came around and said, wait, the eagles are dying because of pesticides?
There was some environmental regulation under Nixon.
Was there?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, okay, go on.
Richard Nixon, for his many flaws, he listened to the prevailing winds of the time, and I mean, he created the EPA.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Richard Nixon's probably one of the most environmentally conscious presidents we've ever had, and it always.
That's why I listen to Hour of History.
It always blows my mind to find myself in this position where I'm like, well, hang on, don't be so rough on Richard Nixon.
Also a Quaker.
Also a war criminal. But yeah, there was a lot the Endangered Species Act was passed under his tenure.
Wow, amazing, yeah. So these eagles have come back down from Acadia, and they've started, building nests in America again. So we do now have Canadian.
The problem, though, is that every time we as a nation see an endangered species make a little bit of a comeback, we're like, oh, great, we can take them off the endangered species list. Now go kill all the gray wolves.
Yeah.
Which is basically what's
happening with the gray wolf.
Right.
And then they're going to be.
They will be gone in our lifetimes, I think.
Yeah.
I think. And the real tragedy. Well, there's so many tragedies with that, but with the decline of wolves comes the increase in coyote presence, because wolves keep coyotes at bay. They keep them away, and coyotes don't have the fear that wolves have of human settlements. So you're going to have a lot more pets, missing from yards and that kind of thing as coyotes. I mean, coyotes are everywhere now, where they used to only be mostly just in the West. Now you're going to find them here in Pennsylvania.
And I think it's because a lot of people didn't learn about Mao's Great Leap Forward and the 4 pests. He said get rid of sparrows, and it created a famine.
He wasn't alone. The U.S. was saying the same thing.
We can kill sparrows still. Sparrows are an invasive species. They're an old world bird that was brought from Europe. So legally, you can just bring your BB gun and shoot sparrows.
The Bureau of Biological Survey, which was the American governmental agency in charge of murdering animals in the turn of the century. I do mean murdering, usually with strychnine.
Wait, what century?
The turn of the 20th century, the 19th into the 20th century.
Like Roosevelt?
Like Teddy Roosevelt. One of his close personal friends was a guy named, I'm blanking on his name right now. C. Hart Merriman. And
Old
C. Hart. And he had the Bureau of Biological Survey, and he hated sparrows. But it's funny because most conservation, as we know it, most legal conservation, with the government getting involved, stems first and foremost from the protection of birds, which you should appreciate.
Yeah.
Because it was always about protecting the exotic birds so they don't get harvested for their plumage.
And what's interesting is it was women who pioneered these efforts.
Because it was women that were buying the hats that was destroying the species.
The woke women were like, don't put that bird feather in your cap, you crazy.
Right.
Boop. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't need to use that word.
No, I didn't. I'm preparing. Yeah.
Good job.
No, but anyway, no, that's wild. And it goes back and it all ties in. to these individuals who want to make a change, who start making a change. Oftentimes, they're in the echelon of the top percent.
Right, like C. Hart Merriman was actually really close friends with Theodore Roosevelt, for instance. So yeah, usually there's like, it's the elites.
Yeah.
To sound like conspirators.
Well, so there's a good message to all of us. You have to continue to follow your goals and get to a certain point, and then you can make the change. Not to say you can't make change where you are.
Sure.
But historically,
I mean, the big waves are usually made at like government levels when it comes to like specifically like animal conservation. The moves that we can make as individuals are a lot less. I mean, yeah.
But they're there. Anyway, we've gone well over an hour. I've just been enjoying it.
Let's make it 2 hours of history.
No, today. I know. Well over an hour. We need to do recommendations. This part of the show where we explain something that you should go check out. So if you're ready, you can go ahead. You could defer.
Would it be gauche to recommend another podcast?
Totally.
It totally would be gauche?
Mm-hmm.
Then I'll recommend. Then you go first. I'll think of something else.
No.
Oh,
gauche is bad.
No, would it be bad form?
I'm only licensed to do historical French. Gauche means left. Droite means right.
Okay.
So it would be droite.
Okay. Well, so it's a droite. It's a droit.
Droit. It's a droit. Oh, that's where we get it.
It is where we get it.
They call cognates. So words that are same. The false cognate is called a faux ami, a false friend.
Y'all are learning all kinds of stuff over here today.
Yeah. Okay. No. So it's totally not gauche.
Okay. Good. Then.
But the left-handers are all right.
I will recommend then a podcast that I've been digging into lately, which it's called Hellbent for Horror. It is a podcast that is done by a guy named S.A. Bradley. He veers too often, in my opinion, into just focusing on horror movies, which I don't have a huge problem with. But he does tend to focus on that. But his brightest points, he delves deeply into like Satan in music, like murder ballads from like the 19th and 18th centuries, or he has like a whole episode devoted to the late night horror presenters, like at local television stations like Elvira and the many different ones like that. He does this great stuff with like early film, like pre-talkies horror, that kind of stuff. His best stuff, he gets into some really historical stuff. So it's called Hellbent for Horror, and I'd recommend particularly the earlier episodes.
Wow, so this is like early popular culture dig.
Yeah, it's I mean, I really love horror because horror is great at exposing anxieties, and since I'm so concerned about what people are thinking as opposed to what they're saying, as a historical interest, looking at something like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, like the two different versions of it, you can really learn a lot about how people felt about communism or capitalism, depending on when you're looking at it. So yeah, I'd recommend that podcast.
That's how I feel about crime novels, actually.
Okay.
In fact, that wasn't my suggestion, but because you've said that, and it's really good, I'm going to shift my suggestion because that is really good. Because crime novels, like horror, do get to the heart of some of our biggest fears and some of the things that, like, what if this relationship had gone wrong and the person was crazy and they just like killed you?
Fun stuff like that.
No, I love it, and so I love this. Anyway, I'm gonna suggest the Scottish novelist Ian Rankin. Okay. Ian Rankin is super interesting in his own right. He was gonna get his PhD at University of Edinburgh studying the novels of Muriel Spark, who wrote The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, and other famous Scottish novels. Halfway through his PhD, he started working on these crime novels, procedurals, and he was like, well, I guess I'll do this.
This is what I'm doing.
And he dropped out, and he ended up creating Detector Rebus, who's now 30 years old, and a new novel comes out in January in the United States. So that will be my suggestion. Cool. Fantastic.
Can I make one more quick comment? Because I meant to say it earlier.
Go for it.
In all of our talk about the recent passing of Stan Lee, there was another brilliant person that passed recently. That's Ricky Jay, the musician, the magician and actor Ricky Jay.
I'm unfamiliar.
He's a unique person. So I recommend also looking at the any of his stuff, just anything Rick J. Ricky
yeah.
J. He wasn't college educated, but he was probably one of the world's foremost experts on the history of magicians, which is a very like weird and specific and very rich history right there. He was a magician himself. He was big on sleight of hand and like up close magic. And he was also a very accomplished actor. He was in Boogie Nights. He was in a lot of David Mamet pictures, and just a really slick, otherworldly guy. Just his voice, his mannerisms. He was just a unique person that shouldn't be forgotten. So if you're not familiar with Ricky J, I'd also recommend looking into anything of his.
Magicians were like the first. They were like early entertainers, right? This magic is just
there's so much fascinating stuff about magic. Like sometimes when I think about history, I'm like, man, like I wish I could just learn it all, right? You know, I mean, like because like just the history of magic itself is extremely deep, rich industry.
I believe Hugh Jackman in The Prestige.
Better than Ed Norton in The Illusionist.
Long tradition of musician.
All right, so 2 hours of history wraps up now.
No, it's been good. Thank you, Travis. We'll have to do Popular Culture Part 3 in the future.
It's always a pleasure.
That's all for today. Thanks for listening on Hour of History, where it's our world, anytime, any place. Have a good one.
Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out our recommendations page at hourofhistory.com/recs. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. There you'll find links to the books mentioned during the podcast, and if you choose to purchase one, you'll be supporting the podcast in the process. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, make sure you head over to the Hour of History blog, found at hourofhistory.com/blog, with articles being released fairly often on topics relating to those covered in the podcast as well as others. With that, we conclude this episode and hope to have you back for the next one. Take care, and again, thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast.